I think that dealing drugs is a person's freedom for the peasantry of the time, no matter what.
See, that's where I disagree. Because so when was the first state to abolish slavery? Vermont in 1777. Why?
Well, kids can't sign contracts,
So
but there's nothing wrong with
Do you see what I'm getting at?
contracts.
Eventually, you do agree that a conservative framework is necessary.
In this video, we are going to cover a debate between Charlie Kirk and socialist streamer Vaush. Now, Vaush has been covered on this channel before, and you guys will know that I have my issues with him. He can be a little bit duplicitous, in my opinion, but props to him for having this debate. And they cover some very interesting topics, so let's get into it.
We can talk about what's happening in schools, the things they're teaching children, and I don't know if either of you has an opinion and wants to start off with...
Floor is yours.
Yeah, so there are two CRTs. There's the critical race theory that I know of, which is a highly esoteric, essentially elective class that you can take in some law schools that teaches you a variety of incredibly eclectic legal theories that some of which I like and some of which I think I disagree with. And then there's the critical race theory that people like Christopher Rufo have been trying to push, a sort of catch-all term to describe all anti-racism. We see these anti-CRT bills being put through straight legislators, and a lot of them don't even mention critical race theory. They mention stuff that's been boilerplate anti-racist theory for like 2 centuries. That stuff really concerns me. If I think that academia is to an extent sacred, of course, all the good things in our society now were born in the halls of academia. The Enlightenment, our democracy, the fair trial that we enjoy if we're arrested, these were things that were originally considered to be the crackpot initiatives of academics, and only through the respect of those ideas have we arrived at, well, what we have today. So if there are problems within academia, I would have them solved in academia, not through the big hand of government reaching in and censoring everyone who says something that disagrees with some political party.
So a point of clarification, you don't believe that critical race theory is in schools?
I think that maybe there are ideas which overlap with critical race theory, but there's always going to be overlap between academic ideas. I mean, you know, I drank water, so did Hitler, one of those type situations.
I think you're coming at it from in good faith, where you're technically correct here that the super academic way of defining critical race theory is not being taught to 4th graders, right? With that
I'd
being
hope so. It'd be pretty
with
tough
that
for
being
them.
said, there are it's almost like saying, you know, we're not teaching advanced geometry to 4th graders, but we are teaching them, you know, very basic math, right? We'll get them the Euclidean geometry. So the very basics of this are definitely in schools, and there's many examples of this, right? The National Education Association literally came out in their press release and said that they are going to push for, and their word was critical race theory, just so we're clear. They use that term, right? That's not Christopher Rufo, that's not James Lindsay, who are good friends of mine. That's the National Education Association, right? And I think they might even be talking about something different than the Delgado theory of critical race theory, right? And so what I want to try to do here, Tim, is we can talk about critical race theory as an academic theory, or we could use a filler term like wokeism, which is more like racial justice, which I actually think would probably be, you know, we can call it racial justice and meet in the middle, right?
I mean, I really feel like there are probably 4-digit number of people in America who are studied on actual critical race theory, not including myself.
And
by the way.
I'm not even prepared to do that. But I'm happy to talk about racial justice education.
So Charlie basically nails it there with that description, and this is a perfect way to think about it. Critical race theory is a worldview, and it's largely a grooming process that starts at a very young age. And this is something I often discuss on this channel. I've done a whole video on the history and the origins of woke ideas, so I'll leave that recommended at the end for you guys. But basically, what these ideas are creating is young people who are coming out of these university institutions like greyhounds out of the starting gate, trying to find racism absolutely everywhere. But more importantly, they're coming out of these institutions thinking that Western civilization as a whole is a terrible thing. Everything is patriarchal and misogynistic, and capitalism is evil, and white people are horrible and terrible. They're not being taught critical race theory in the more legal academic sense, but they are being taught to develop a critical consciousness. And this, in my opinion, is a lot worse because it's subversive, and it's designed to systematically brainwash very malleable young people. At least if they were being taught critical race theory as a subject, they would be being honest about it. But that's what happens when your ideas don't stand up to public scrutiny. You have to implant it into children whilst their parents' backs are turned. And now a bit more about racism, anti-racism, and I'll give a little bit more context afterwards.
Let's go to just piece, you know,
yeah, sure.
issue by issue. Ibram X. Kendi, who's kind of one of the, you know, archangels of the wokeism movement.
Beloved figure in the minds of conservatives and liberals alike.
So Ibram X. Kendi, and I'm paraphrasing, and you guys could pick up the quote, is that we need discrimination today because there is discrimination yesterday. That's the essence of the quote, right, Tim?
Yeah, he said the only solution for past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only solution for present discrimination is future discrimination.
So I find that to be reprehensible. What say you?
I think it's misguided in large part because I don't believe if there was some god who could just distribute all resources in a perfectly ordained way and did so at the snap of a finger, then maybe that would be a decent argument. In the real world, we have to go through politics, and any kind of discriminatory treatment under any circumstances, no matter how well intentioned, is going to have adverse effects. So with regard to what he said, there is a very charitable interpretation, and that charitable interpretation is discriminatory practices in the past necessitate favorable practices today, a way of bringing people up. My reparations argument, I mean, the poor in this country have always had it bad, at least worse than they could otherwise. That is essentially a version of that argument. Preferable treatment towards the poor. We do this with welfare because there are systemic barriers keeping them from full participation.
The next question then is, should we be teaching first and second and third graders to be hyper-conscious aware of race all the time? I think that's destructive. I think it goes against the American promise of e pluribus unum, of caring more about character than skin color. And yes, Martin Luther King Jr. was a mixed bag when it came to this stuff.
He's a cool guy.
But he was a very radical socialist in some regard, but he really hit it perfectly when he said that this was the ideal of the American system. Do you see any downsides to getting 3-year-olds just caring, not 3-year-olds, third graders caring about the color of people's skin all the time?
Well, I think depending on their environment, they might already, whether they know it or not, in very implicit and subtle ways. We know from tests done, for example, on like little kids, like 4-year-olds or whatever, that some elements of implicit racial bias already infect their thinking. Now, that isn't a moral judgment. We're all flawed beings. We live and we die. We all have biases. That is just a part of life. But I think conversations about those things can be valuable. I don't believe we live in a colorblind world, so teaching people that we do can often lead them to remain ignorant to evident problems. Now, to what extent would you be comfortable, what would you say, like bringing a racial consciousness to third graders?
For me, very little to none. As don't care about it, de-emphasize it, look at the spirit, the soul, the conduct, and the character of the human being. Their skin color means nothing. Not saying that you should start to emphasize, organize what people look like, because therefore it means something that we're going to tell you. A great example is that this is the textbook definition of stereotyping, right? Is that if you see a black person, you don't know their history. You don't know if they're the son of a Nigerian billionaire. You don't know if they're an immigrant from Turks and Caicos. And you don't know if they're the 9th generation descendant of slaves, right? There's been 2 million blacks that have come to America legally through the immigration process since 1980. So this sort of hyper-fixation on race.
So Ibram X. Kendi, who changed his name from Ibram Henry Rogers, because I guess that doesn't quite have the same revolutionary ring to it, is the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, a book that you may remember featured heavily on the Instagram stories of white girls after George Floyd's death. He's one of the primary race hustlers and has become very wealthy off of white guilt and off of promoting actual discrimination and racism, rather than unity and love of the other. And his quote that they referred to was, "The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination." Sounds like a very productive cycle, right? He's not a cool guy and not somebody who should be listened to, in my humble opinion. But there are some fantastic voices out there. Activists who I think are doing a good job. I'm a big fan of Killer Mike. I certainly don't agree with everything he does, but he seems to really care and he calls out his own side when necessary. I also love what Kevin Hart's doing. He goes into inner city communities and he actually preaches and teaches financial literacy. And of course, the GOAT, the king of data, facts, and empirical knowledge, Dr. Thomas Sowell. If only we could clone that man. Now on to the next part where the two have a conversation about the founding of America and American history and national pride and what that looked like. And I found this part very interesting.
But there are some things that I think could be done well. For example, say you're teaching about very basic early history, you know?
This is where I wanted to get to.
Yeah, okay.
This is important.
So here are some things about America's founding that I like. One of the first practical liberal democracies, glory of the republic. Folks had nice hair back then.
Not a democracy, but a republic.
Right.
That's
Well,
okay.
I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, and we of course did more to fulfill the promise of a democracy with time. But obviously, when America was founded, it was a slave state. 1 in every 6 people in America at that time was human property.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
How many states had abolished slavery by the time the Constitution was ratified?
Well, I don't know the exact number.
9 out
But
of
I imagine-
13. That's not a slave country.
Well, then you could say it was a confederacy with portions that were slave
I think
states.
that's better said. 9 out of 13 had already abolished. There was a sunset moratorium for slavery in the Constitution.
So this could...
Vermont abolished slavery in 1777. We were on the way to eradication. We were not a slave country.
Well, hold on. I mean,
and I'll add one thing.
we were on the way, but then like 80 years later, it was still happening.
So the question is why, right? That's a really important question. And
Economics, I imagine.
Well, yeah, so Cotton Gin and John C. Calhoun. Happy to
hold
go
on.
through that.
If you're enjoying this content, guys, chuck a thumbs up on the video. It makes YouTube say, hey, there's something going on here. I'm going to recommend this video. And also, guys, just to let you know, if you hit that notification bell, you can catch the live premieres. Every single video, we do a live premiere where we've got up to 1,000 people in the chat, all talking about the video. I'm in there talking with everybody on all of the live premieres, and it's heaps of fun. So hit that notification bell if you haven't already. Back to the clips.
Part of the kind of archangel triumphant of the wokeism coalition is Nicole Hannah-Jones, Robin DiAngelo, and Ibram X. Kendi. And Nicole Hannah-Jones in particular, right, the author of the 1619 Project, she heretically says that America was founded on slavery, right? And so
I'd
part
be
of,
okay with that.
but it's just not true.
It depends on what you mean by founded on.
She defines this. She says the founding fathers were in favor of it. Not true. George Washington wasn't. John Adams wasn't. John Quincy Adams wasn't. Thomas Jefferson even signed a moratorium of new slaves coming into the United States. Ben Franklin chaired an anti-slavery convention in 1775. None of these guys were writing expositionally how wonderful slavery was.
Well, this isn't being taught to third graders, right? The 1619 Project's a little New York op-ed.
No, it's
part of
not.
the-
See, that's where you're wrong. The 1619 Project's being implemented as school district curriculum in thousands of school districts across the country.
I've
That's
seen-
true.
well,
Across the
It's
country.
not just like a podcast. This is curriculum.
Right, there are principles of the 1619 Project that I think are defensible. First of all, we as Americans tend to think of the founding of our country as its legal founding, you know? But the legal founding of the United States didn't really mean much for a slave. I mean, it really didn't matter that much for the peasantry of the time, no matter what.
See, that's where I disagree. Because so when was the first state to abolish slavery? Vermont in 1777. Why?
Well, I mean, for the
because they
slaves
were
who lived
inspired
in-
by the Declaration of Independence. Things started to change in that year.
I have to wonder, is it not the prerogative, and I'm not assigning this to you, of tyrants to make sure that the children who graduate from their schools find no fault in the nations they're taught to love?
See, I never said no fault, but you could be thankful for something, and you can have a holistic view of something and understand that there were stumbles and there were missteps, while also being pretty freaking proud of that something. How exceptional this project
What
is.
if there are current problems, like today, you know?
We should talk about those. Like we already talked about fatherlessness, government overreach.
So interesting there, and I'll be reading the comments, guys, and especially the Americans who watch the channel. How were you taught about American history? Were you taught to be grateful or hateful? And here's my perspective on this. From the Australian perspective, we have a very similar issue in our country, especially surrounding the way that Australian history is taught and the supposed whitewashing of Australian history, in the sense that there are a lot of dark parts of Australian history that the Indigenous activists think is not taught enough. And in my opinion, history should be taught accurately. However, self-flagellating and teaching that your country is evil is not helpful to anybody, and it doesn't actually help when you're trying to move forward. It's important to understand history objectively, and one of the parts of understanding history objectively is that it was pretty much a bloodbath, and many terrible things happened, and that the place that you're from is not uniquely evil, and it's fantastic that we've made such progress as human beings, and we should keep on striving to make said progress together. We cannot move forward if we are constantly looking in the rearview mirror. And if we're always just self-flagellating and looking into the past, then that's a great way to completely demoralize a nation. And trust me, there are a lot of people with ill intentions who would love to see a demoralized Western world. And in Australia, we have an incredible culture of mateship, brotherhood, hard work, and humility. A culture that's been essential in building what Australia is today, and at times extremely harsh conditions, and in only a few hundred years. This is a culture that resonates deeply with older Australians, especially those that experienced times like the Vietnam War, But the younger generation, they don't care for it at all. And honestly, I don't even like talking about this because it breaks my heart to see what has become of my country. But if the Aussies who watch the channel would like to see me cover this from time to time, then let me know.
Income mobility here, which is the measure for how effectively this country manages its meritocratic systems, is higher in some European countries than it is here. The idea remains valuable to me, but I can't help but think maybe we could make it better. If making it better entails some highly destructive process that involves tearing down everything we've ever known and such, then, eventually you have to do a risk-reward benefit, right?
So what I'm trying to caution you about is that the people pushing CRT or wokeism, they don't have the same sort of nuance that you do. These are revolutionaries that want to tear down the system.
But I am as well. I just think that everything has its time.
You just had kind of a little bit more of a moderated answer.
But how often do actual critical race theorists come on all of the talk show circuits that end up? We've had some. Joy Reid advocated for it, but the actual scholars.
They're running Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman. They're running the United States military. They're running the way. They're assigning these ideas again. Wokeism. Let's use that.
With Robin DiAngelo and the federal
white fragility.
Right. I'm not a big fan of her, largely because I think her language incites a lot of negative discourse. I think that it's bad for publication. Maybe good in an academic setting.
So not good to teach generals that.
For some random people at a business? Absolutely not. No.
Generals in the military.
Oh, yeah, sure. No.
Because that's what's happening.
Well, the big problem that I have, but keep in mind, that's not wokeists running these things. What happens is this, and put pretty simply, the majority of Americans broadly are progressive on these issues, support BLM, all these sort of broad cultural markers. So corporations and other large entities think we need to avoid a cancellation, we need to appeal to the business interests of this country, we need to do something to ingratiate ourselves to the majority opinion. So oftentimes, and they've done this for decades, by the way, is they find some consultants, they pay them $300,000.
Like Robin DiAngelo.
To come on over there, and Robin DiAngelo's job, first and foremost, is to convince everyone who hires her that she was worth that money. So is she going to come over there and write a PowerPoint don't be racist, come on, be cool? No, she has to go all out. And what you get are these cringy, the Coca-Cola PowerPoint, where you get, look, some of the things there are defensible. Does systemic racism exist? Sure. Should we be aware of the concept of implicit bias? Yeah, fine. That's good. That's just normal human things, I think. But some of the language in there really made it seem like she wanted white people to feel a little bit bad. And I don't want white people to feel bad.
So he just casually throws in there that he wants to tear down the system, but, he's wearing glasses and what appears to be a white coat, and he has a nice, smooth baritone voice, so it doesn't sound so bad. But interestingly, what he said there about the corporations is wrong, and it's just manifestly wrong, and this is obvious now. We know now that companies are not doing this because of popular support and because everyone's woke. Companies are doing this because they have to, because of the ESG agenda. And we also know that BLM is certainly not getting the popular support, and that woke companies are going broke. Look at Bud Light. Look at these Hollywood woke movies that are just tanking and falling on their face continuously. And this was filmed in August 2021, so it's amazing to see how much public consciousness about this sinister agenda has changed. Kind of gives me hope, I guess. Needless to say, if he brought this up in the context of 2023, Charlie Kirk would be able to easily refute this. Probably bring up receipts as well.
But there's other nations today that have those values that we would never call fascist, like Japan. Japan has very strict immigration.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Korea is actually a better example, to be honest.
I really don't like either of those countries for the reasons that I've described.
You don't like Korea?
I think they're both deeply conservative countries.
I agree with you.
Right.
They're wonderful.
And I think they do so in part because there's a degree of anti-individualism in the subservience they all expect of the common good. Now, it's funny. I feel like our roles are being reversed a little bit here.
Isn't that interesting?
The common good isn't something I appeal to. For me, the value I want to maximize.
No, I just appeal to the good.
The good, sure. The
Which
good
is two different things.
Is freedom. That's what I care about most. And that's what libertarian socialism is about. There are many types of freedoms, positive and negative. If I might indulge very briefly, is a man thrown to a lawless desert without food, water, or clothing free? I'm really asking.
So, probably no.
I agree. He's free to die.
But that's an extreme example,
Sure.
not applicable in modern wealthy America.
No,
or
but-
any Western nation.
But it's a philosophical base.
It's also a Rousseauian argument. Man's born free, and he, spends the rest of his life in chains. It's
Right.
just anti-commercial in nature.
Well, no, but it's a base philosophical argument because it's true. They're lawless. There's nothing preventing him from doing anything in that environment, but he has no ability to act on
But
his
do you know what he
desires.
does have? Consciousness.
Well, sure.
So that's a natural rights doctrine that I will defend.
Well, I mean, I like consciousness too. The only point that I'm getting at is when it comes to people's freedom and the ability for people to protect their freedom, this is what I care about. It's what Marx cared about. If you actually read what he wrote, and
I've read Das Kapital. I've read the Manifesto.
Then
And guess what? He was right about some things.
then you know.
But not everything.
He didn't
And
talk
he was really wrong
about equality. He didn't write on equality. He wrote on freedom because he believed that society was a very complex, interlocking network of systems that in some ways liberated men and in other ways enslaved them.
But do you know what he got wrong? He got wrong that sometimes people can be free for other devices that they are not able to regulate. They can be free not from alcoholism, drug addiction, some sort of any other sort of perverse addiction. The idea of freedom is a very libertarian.
But I
view of
agree with
freedom.
that, though.
No, I
So
know you do.
the greatest
I say
society-
that. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Just the greatest society is one where a man is born and there are as few things as possible preventing him from doing whatever he wants for the rest of his
I
life,
totally disagree.
so long as, of course, he doesn't deprive others of the ability to do the same.
So I think that's a miserable society.
Freedom?
No, that's not freedom. That's licentiousness or degeneracy. That's chaos.
What is degeneracy? I like men.
How about pedophilia?
Okay. Well, obviously
You said
that would
whatever
infringe-
he wants. Is
as long as they
pedophilia a
don't-
freedom vouch?
As long as they don't infringe on the rights of others. I'm sure you could believe, I would believe
Well,
that.
so then,
infringes
so
on the
there
rights of
are
others.
limits on freedom, is what you're saying. It's not this Wild West
Yeah, well,
campaign.
as
So where
long
do you
as
get
you-
those limits from?
Well, obviously, you would probably have to have a pretty complex interlocking legal system to determine what we agree upon as like a reasonable limits we can place on people's behavior. We have that now to an extent.
No, I know. So like pedophilia, bad.
that
right?
would be a bad thing.
Okay, kidnapping,
That would be a bad thing.
rape.
That would be a bad thing.
Why do you think those things are bad?
I think they're bad because you're stripping other people of the ability to do that which they will. With all those examples, you're inflicting harm on a person.
How about dealing drugs?
I think that dealing drugs is a person's freedom, as is taking a
But
person's.
you're taking
What
some-
about dealing drugs to kids?
Dealing drugs to kids, I think I would disagree with that, probably because I think there's something exceptional about addictive substances and children. That being said, I think a lot of stuff would apply to children specifically. Contract law. Kids can't sign contracts.
So
But there's
do you,
nothing wrong
do you see
with
what I'm getting at?
contracts.
Eventually, you do agree that a conservative framework is necessary.
But I don't think that's a conservative framework because there are other things I care about that you would always disagree with, like collective ownership of the means of production.
yeah, I totally disagree.
Which,
I think private property and freedom are linked together.
which would give workers the most freedom possible.
So, for a little bit of irony here, he actually was just making the case that children aren't capable of signing contracts, but he does think that children are capable of changing their genders. He doesn't say it in this video, but it is one of his beliefs. And this is where, having listened to other things that he's said in the past, I begin to think that this man has a serious problem with duplicitousness. Like he'll say one thing to their face to appease them and to avoid conflict, and then behind their back, something totally different. And he's also a Marxist. And like I said before, you can say it in a smooth baritone voice all you like, but it doesn't change the fact that this ideology has claimed the lives of tens of millions of people. He can claim that Marx wanted freedom all he likes, and he can put the word libertarian after socialist until he goes purple. But the only freedom that has been allowed under these systems is the freedom for tyrants to kill tens of millions of people with impunity. This is a worldview that rejects individual freedom by design. And now onto the last bit where I'm actually in agreement with Vaush.
Do you guys think philosophy could be taught instead of CRT, like Plato's allegory and the cave? In my opinion, stuff like this helps people better understand one another individually.
I'm hugely in favor of more theoretical classes being taught to high schoolers. Philosophy, sociology, and I don't know what the modern equivalent of like finances or home ec would be, but something like that. Kids graduate, they don't know anything about anything when it comes to managing their finances, which is weird.
We agree.
Because that will destroy them if they don't. Like, why don't we teach them that? Philosophy, everyone should be learned on, just flat out. That's just, I think that's a moral necessity. And when it comes to sociology, I'm not even talking like left-leaning inclinations on that. I mean like the basic ability to read like statistical information on what's going on, because for the rest of their lives they're going to be asked to vote based on political information they don't have the education to understand.
Yeah, I mean, philosophy comes from a Greek word, love of wisdom, philos, sophos, and we definitely don't have that right now in our country. And yeah, I'm a big fan of teaching it. I just want to teach it correctly. I'd say a lot less Nietzsche and Kant and Hume and a lot more Aristotle and Locke and Aquinas and Augustine. And I think the problem is, though, if philosophy, if left if not, so Plato would say this. So Plato would say, I'm not going to teach philosophy until you could do advanced Euclidean geometry. It was his rule. Now, why would he have that rule? He's like, if you can't think rationally and be able to determine good ideas from bad ideas in the I'm not going to even get close to teaching you about the allegory of the cave or the ship or Plato's Republic or the forms. So I think there's actually something to that if you introduce philosophy too early, you can create kind of one-liner philosophers that think they understand the entire world. And it really goes to that expression, the more I know, the more I realize how little I knew when I thought I knew it all. That's the kind of that idea of daring to know.
The corollary is true too. You know, the scientists who worked in the Manhattan Project, many of them said they cultivated inspiration from religion and from philosophy, completely outside the bound of physics, but it got their brain a jogging.
This was an interesting part, an interesting end to things, and it's something that I'm in agreement with both of these men on categorically. The types of philosophy that would be studied might be a little bit different, but philosophy is very important. And also financial literacy and the other things that they mentioned. Societies that don't do this are really missing out, basically the whole Western world. And sometimes the conspiracy theorist in me thinks that this is intentional. They don't want an educated and critical thinking population that are able to think outside the parameters of the matrix, if you will. And perhaps they don't want you to be financially literate, but rather dependent on the government. And they don't want you to be able to analyze data, but rather they want you to accept the emotional rhetoric. All I know is that I wish I had have learned this stuff earlier. Maybe I wouldn't have been basically a monkey until I was 25. And side note, Charlie Kirk always does impress me with his encyclopedia-like knowledge of the arts. A lot of the times, these highly logical, data-driven, politician-like personality guys can be a little bit stiff when it comes to discussing ideas that are a bit more abstract, that exist a little bit more within the metaphysical. And this part of the conversation reminded me that I actually need to brush up on my philosophical knowledge, need to read some more ancient Greek literature. And I'll be doing so, and maybe I'll even talk about it on the channel. So keep an eye out for that over the next few months. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Catch me on the socials, hit those links below if you want to come and say hi. And also, if you guys want to watch another video, click right here. Until next time, I'm Jake. This is RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.